Welcome to Files of the Damned. This story begins with a dinner party in 1979. It is a story about a stranger, a warning ignored, and a tragedy that would haunt a family for decades. The setting was a quiet suburb in Evanston, Illinois, just outside Chicago. The neighborhood was full of tidy brick houses and tree-lined streets. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. Richard and Emily Harrow lived in a two-story colonial house on Oak Ridge Drive. Richard was a dentist, and Emily was a schoolteacher. They had two children, both away at college. On November 10, 1979, they decided to host a small dinner party. It was a rare occasion for the couple, who were known for keeping to themselves. Emily invited 4 friends from the school where she taught. Richard invited a fellow dentist and his wife. It was meant to be a quiet evening of good food and conversation. But one unexpected guest would change everything. The night of the dinner was cold and windy. Emily had set the table with her best china. Candles flickered in the dining room as she placed the roast in the oven. At 6:45 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. There was laughter as coats were taken and wine was poured. The group gathered in the living room, chatting and sipping drinks. At 7:15 p.m., the doorbell rang again. Emily assumed it was another guest. She opened the door and froze. A man stood on the porch. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit and overcoat. His head was tilted slightly downward, as though he was looking at the ground. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was soft and polite. Emily hesitated. She did not recognize him. She asked his name, but he did not answer directly. "I was told there would be a place for me," he said. Emily thought perhaps he was a friend of one of Richard's colleagues. Not wanting to be rude, she stepped aside and let him in. The man removed his hat and coat. When Emily looked at him, she realized something was wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and where his eyes should have been were only smooth, sunken hollows. She gasped. The man smiled faintly. "I hope I'm not too late," he said. Emily was too stunned to speak. Richard appeared in the hallway, asking who had arrived. When he saw the man, he stopped in his tracks. The guests in the living room turned to look. An uneasy silence filled the house. The man simply walked to the dining room and sat down at the table. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. No one moved. Finally, one of the guests whispered, "Richard, who is he?" Richard stammered that he didn't know. But the man interrupted. "I was invited," he said calmly. "This is where I belong tonight." Emily whispered that perhaps they should call the police. The man turned his head toward her. "There's no need for that," he said softly. "I only came to deliver a message." The guests exchanged nervous glances. Richard stepped closer and asked what the message was. The man's expression did not change. "One of you will not see tomorrow," he said. Gasps filled the room. Emily clutched Richard's arm. Someone demanded to know if this was a joke. The man shook his head. "It has already been decided," he said. The dinner party was in chaos. One guest rushed to the phone and dialed the police, but when the operator answered, the line went dead. The man remained seated at the table. He did not move, he did not blink. Richard shouted at him to leave. The man stood slowly and walked to the front door. But before he left, he turned back and spoke. "You should not be here when it happens," he said. Then he stepped into the night and vanished. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The guests were shaken and frightened, but none had been harmed. The officers searched the house and the yard. There was no sign of the man. They checked the snow-covered sidewalk for footprints. There were none. The police filed a report and told the group to stay calm. They said it was likely a prank. They left just after 10 p.m. The guests debated leaving, but Emily begged them to stay. She said she did not want to be alone. The group sat nervously in the living room. No one touched the food. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. At 11:45 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. Someone screamed. Richard fumbled for a flashlight and found one in the kitchen drawer. He shined the beam into the living room. Emily was gone. They searched the entire house, calling her name. There was no answer. One of the guests ran to the front door and opened it. The cold wind rushed in, carrying snowflakes across the floor. There, in the yard, lay Emily's body. Her face was pale, and her eyes were missing. The police returned minutes later. They taped off the yard and questioned everyone. No one had seen or heard anything. Emily's body had no wounds other than the missing eyes. There were no footprints in the snow. The officers could not explain how it had happened. One guest told them about the man with no eyes. The police checked their records. There was no evidence he had ever been in the house. Emily's death devastated Richard. He buried her 3 days later in the town cemetery. But the tragedy was not over. Because exactly 1 year later, another dinner guest from that night would be found dead. And like Emily, their eyes would be missing. Emily Harrow's death shattered everyone who had been at the dinner party. The guests could not understand what had happened that night. The image of the pale man with no eyes haunted their memories. The police ruled Emily's death a homicide. But there were no leads. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, and no signs of forced entry. The case quickly went cold. Richard Harrow withdrew from the world. He stopped going to work. He rarely left the house. He told friends he could still feel the man's presence. The other guests tried to move on, but the fear stayed with them. On November 10, 1980, exactly 1 year after Emily's death, the surviving dinner guests received phone calls. Each call came at the same time, 8 p.m. Each call was silent. An hour later, the first guest died. Linda Carson, one of Emily's closest friends, lived alone. She was found dead in her living room the next morning. Her eyes had been removed, just like Emily's. There was no sign of a break-in. The police questioned the other dinner guests, but no one knew anything. Linda had not called anyone for help. There were no neighbors who saw anything unusual. The coroner could not determine the exact time of death, but the phone call at 8:00 p.m. now seemed like a warning. The pattern became clear the next year. On November 10, 1981, another guest died. This time, it was Dr. Howard Miles, the dentist who had been Richard's colleague. He was found in his car, slumped behind the wheel. His eyes were gone. The doors were locked from the inside. The car was parked outside his office. He had been alive and well hours earlier. When investigators reviewed security cameras in the area, they saw something chilling. At 7:58 p.m., Dr. Miles walked to his car. He unlocked the door, got inside, and started the engine. Then, on the edge of the frame, a man appeared. He was tall and thin, wearing a black suit and overcoat. His head was tilted downward. The camera went dark for 20 seconds. When the feed returned, the man was gone, and Dr. Miles was dead. The police were now convinced that someone was hunting the dinner guests one by one, but they could not identify the man. Every attempt to enhance the footage failed. Richard Harrow begged the police for protection. He said the man would come for him next. The police agreed to place him under surveillance. But Richard's fear only deepened as the anniversary approached. On November 10, 1982, Richard locked himself in his house. 2 officers sat outside in a patrol car. Another officer waited in the living room. At exactly 8 p.m., the phone rang. Richard refused to answer. The ringing stopped after 4 tones. The officer in the living room checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Then he heard a noise from upstairs. The officer ran up the staircase and kicked open the bedroom door. Richard was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was alive and holding a Bible. The officer asked if he was all right. Richard nodded but would not speak. The officer stepped closer. That was when he saw the hollow sockets where Richard's eyes had been. Richard slumped forward and fell to the floor. The man with no eyes had claimed another victim. The surviving dinner guests were now in full panic. They believed they were being marked for death, but they did not know how to stop it. Some moved out of Illinois. Others changed their phone numbers and addresses, but the man always seemed to find them. On November 10, 1983, another guest, Marilyn Holt, died in St. Louis. She had moved there only months earlier. She lived in a secure apartment building with cameras in the hallways. At 8:00 p.m., the cameras captured her standing at her front door. She appeared to be speaking to someone in the hallway, but no one else was visible. She stepped back into the apartment and closed the door. 30 minutes later, her neighbor heard a thud. When the neighbor entered the apartment, Marilyn was dead. Her eyes were missing. By 1984, only 3 guests from the dinner party remained: George and Karen Willis, a married couple, and Ellen Parker, a teacher from Emily's school. They decided to break the pattern. Instead of staying home on November 10th, they would gather in one place with police protection. They chose a motel in Wisconsin. The police set up a command post next door. Officers watched the room from outside and monitored the parking lot. At 7:58 p.m., the phone in the motel room rang. No one answered. 2 minutes later, the lights in the motel flickered. The officers outside reported seeing a tall man in a black suit walking toward the room. By the time they entered, it was too late. George and Karen Willis were dead. They were seated side by side on the motel bed. Their eyes were missing, but Ellen Parker was gone. The officers searched the entire building. There was no sign of her. The security cameras showed only static. For the next year, the police searched for Ellen. They feared she was dead. But in November 1985, she called the Evanston Police Department. She was alive. She said she had been hiding in Canada. She said she knew who the man with no eyes was. But before she could explain, the line went dead. The police traced the call to a payphone outside a bus station in Toronto. By the time they arrived, Ellen was gone. She was never seen again. The deaths ended after Ellen's disappearance. The man with no eyes was never caught. But the legend of the dinner party grew. In Evanston, people whispered about the Harrow House on Oak Ridge Drive. They said you could still see a pale man standing at the dining room window at night. They said if you looked into his face, you would see only darkness where his eyes should be. In 1989, the house was sold to a new family. They knew nothing about the murders. But on their first night in the house, the phone rang at 8 p.m. The caller was silent, and in the dining room, the family's youngest child pointed to the table and said, "Mommy, why is that man staring at me?" The Harrow House stood empty for nearly a year after the murders ended. Neighbors avoided walking past it at night. They said they saw a pale figure standing in the dining room window. But in 1989, a new family bought the property. They were the Rileys, a young couple with 2 children. They knew nothing about the house's dark history. On their first night in the house, the phone rang at exactly 8:00 p.m. When Mrs. Riley answered, there was only silence. Later that evening, their youngest child pointed to the dining room table and asked, "Why is that man staring at me?" The Rileys tried to dismiss it as their child's imagination, but strange things began happening almost immediately. Every night, the phone rang at 8 p.m. There was never a voice on the line. Objects moved around the house when no one was looking. Doors closed by themselves, and the family often felt as though they were being watched. After 2 weeks, they called a local pastor for help. The pastor, Father Douglas, blessed the house and prayed in every room. But when he reached the dining room, the temperature dropped suddenly. He said he felt a presence standing in the corner. "The man is here," he whispered. He advised the Rileys to leave the house immediately. They refused. They had spent their savings on the home. They said they could not afford to move again. On November 10, 1989, the Rileys invited Father Douglas to return. They wanted him to stay with them through the night. At 7:58 p.m., the phone rang. Father Douglas told them not to answer. The ringing stopped. Then came 3 loud knocks at the front door. Mr. Riley opened it. No one was there, but on the doorstep lay an envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph. It showed the Harrow house's dining room table set for a meal. But the photo was at least 10 years old. At the head of the table sat a man in a black suit. His face was turned toward the camera. Where his eyes should have been were only smooth, sunken hollows. Father Douglas told the Rileys to burn the photograph. They did, but the damage was already done. That night, the Rileys heard footsteps in the hallway. They heard someone moving around the dining room. The children screamed that a man was standing at the foot of their beds. At midnight, Father Douglas performed an emergency exorcism. He read prayers aloud and sprinkled holy water throughout the house. The temperature dropped so low that the family could see their breath. The lights flickered violently. Then everything went quiet. They thought it was over. They thought the danger had passed. But at 8:00 p.m. the next night, the phone rang again. This time Mrs. Riley answered. All she heard was a man's voice. "I was invited," he said softly. Then the line went dead. The Rileys gathered their things and fled the house that night. They never looked back. The property was abandoned again. Locals began calling it the Harrow House. Teenagers would dare each other to break in after dark. Most came out terrified. They told of a tall man wearing a black suit standing silently at the dining room table. They said he had no face and no eyes. Some claimed he followed them through the house. When they turned to look at him, his face was blank, featureless. But the most terrifying part was when they described his eyes, or lack of them. They said there were no eyes. In 1993, a group of paranormal investigators paid a visit to the Harrow house. They set up cameras and audio recorders in every room. They wanted to document any strange activity, anything at all that might explain the legends surrounding the house on Oak Ridge Drive. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped dramatically. Then, at exactly 8:00 p.m., every phone in the house rang simultaneously. The team answered one of them. All they heard was a man's voice. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Then the power went out. Moments later, the lights returned. One of the investigators was missing. Her name was Mary. She had vanished without a trace. Her body was never found. The rest of the team fled the house. They didn't stop running until they reached their cars. Shaken but unharmed, they decided to abandon their investigation. After that, the city of Evan, Illinois, condemned the Harrow house. They boarded up the windows and locked the doors, but not before placing a warning sign on the lawn. It read, "Danger, keep out, enter at your own risk." The legend of the dinner guest with no eyes continued to grow. Some believed he was a demon. Others believed he was the ghost of a man who died at the house decades earlier. But the truth was far more disturbing. In 1998, a retired police detective named Paul Mercer began reviewing the old Harrow case files. He was hoping to find something the others had missed, some small detail that might explain what happened to the Riley family and those who entered the house after them. He was looking for answers. Then he noticed something unusual. The name Harrow appeared in another unsolved case from 1954. That year, a man named Lawrence Harrow had been arrested for murdering his wife and children at a dinner party. He had removed their eyes, but Lawrence Harrow was acquitted due to lack of evidence. He disappeared shortly after the trial. Mercer believed Lawrence Harrow was connected to the murders in 1979. He believed the man with no eyes was Lawrence himself or his ghost. But there was a problem. Lawrence Harrow had died in 1963. His body was buried in a cemetery less than a mile from Oak Ridge Drive. So, Detective Mercer paid a visit to the grave. He was hoping to put the legend to rest once and for all. But when he arrived, he made a horrifying discovery. The grave was empty. The retired detective believed Lawrence's spirit had returned to the family home. He believed the original dinner party in 1979 had invited him back into the world. So Mercer petitioned the city to have the Harrow house demolished. But before the order could be carried out, the house caught fire and burned to the ground. No one was inside. The cause of the fire was never determined. The property has remained empty ever since. But locals say the man with no eyes still walks the neighborhood. They say if you walk down Oak Ridge Drive on November 10th, you will see him. He will be standing where the dining room once was. And if you meet his gaze, though there are no eyes to see, he will follow you home. To this day, no one knows why Lawrence Harrow, the entity he became, chose those dinner guests. But one thing is certain, he was invited once, and he has never left. Thank you for watching Files of the Damned. Be sure to subscribe for more true stories the world tried to erase.